Blood doesn't wash out of wood, not after 80 years, not after 1,000 scrubbings, not after countless Sunday services, weddings, and baptisms. In a small stone church in Normandy, there are pews with stains that refuse to fade. Dark patches in the grain that look like shadows, but aren't. They're proof. Proof that in June of 1944, in the middle of the deadliest invasion in human history, 2 young Americans with no weapons and no backup turned this building into the one place where the war was not allowed to win. 70 to 80 wounded men passed through those doors over 72 hours. Americans, Germans, French civilians, men who were supposed to be killing each other. Every single one walked out alive. This story is true. It happened in Angoville-au-Plain, a village in Normandy, France, during the first 3 days after D-Day, June 6th through June 8th. The church still stands, the bloodstains are still visible, and the men who made it happen were real. Their names were Kenneth and Robert Wright. This is how they did it, and why it almost didn't happen at all. Kenneth Joseph Moore grew up in a place so small it didn't have a traffic light. Rural Indiana, cornfields, gravel roads, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and bad news traveled faster than good. When Ken was 12, he watched a man die. His neighbor, Mr. Hoffman, a man who'd taught Ken to fish, who'd let him ride on the tractor during harvest, had an accident in the field. The combine caught his arm, tore it open from wrist to shoulder. Ken was there when it happened, so were 4 other men. And all of them, grown men, strong men, men who could lift bales and fix engines, stood there frozen while Mr. Hoffman bled out in the dirt, calling for his wife. It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes for a man to die because no one knew what to do. Ken never forgot the sound Mr. Hoffman made at the end, not a scream, just a sigh, like he was disappointed. That night, Ken's father found him sitting on the porch steps, staring at his hands. "I should have done something," Ken whispered. "I just stood there." His father didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. He just sat down beside him and said, "Then next time, don't stand there." When Ken enlisted in 1942, he signed up to be a medic because he'd spent 10 years looking at his hands and wondering if they could do more than just hold a rifle. At airborne medical training, his instructors quickly noticed something about Private Moore. He didn't flinch. When they ran drills under simulated fire, other men ducked, hesitated, second-guessed. Ken just moved, faster than anyone in his class, not because he was fearless, because he'd already seen what happened when people froze. The night before D-Day, Ken wrote a letter home. "Mom, I know you're scared. I am too. But I'd rather be scared doing something that saves lives than scared doing something that takes them. If I don't come back, know that I was trying to make sure someone else's son does." He sealed the letter, not knowing if she'd ever read it. But he knew Mr. Hoffman's wife had never gotten to say goodbye. That, at least, he could fix. Robert Eugene Wright was Ken's opposite in almost every way. Brooklyn, New York, apartment building, subway, corner store, the kind of neighborhood where you learn to talk fast, walk faster, and never show weakness. Bob had wanted to be a doctor since he was 8 years old, not because of some dramatic moment, but because one winter his little sister got scarlet fever, and the only reason she survived was because a doctor from the free clinic came to their apartment at 2 in the morning and stayed until the fever broke. Bob never forgot the way his mother cried when the doctor left. Not from grief, from relief. "I want to make people cry like that," Bob told his father the next day. His father, exhausted from a double shift at the docks, just nodded. "Then you better get smart, kid." Bob did. He worked. He studied. He was 2 semesters into pre-med at City College when Pearl Harbor happened. Enlistment wasn't a debate in Bob's house. When the country called, Wrights answered. But Bob didn't want to carry a rifle. "I can do more good keeping soldiers alive than making the other side dead," he told the recruiter. At training, Bob Wright was the guy who asked 1,000 questions, not to be annoying, because he needed to know every technique, every procedure, every mistake that could kill someone. One night, 2 weeks before deployment, Bob sat in the barracks after lights out, going over his aid kit for the 10th time that day. Ken, in the bunk across from him, finally spoke up. "Right. You planning to memorize the serial number on every bandage?" Bob didn't look up. "If I forget something, someone dies. If you don't sleep, you die. Then they both die." Bob set the kit down, looked at Ken in the dim light. "You scared?" Bob asked. Ken didn't lie. "Every damn day. Me too." That's how they became friends, not through bravado, through honesty. By the time they boarded the plane to Normandy, Ken Moore and Robert Wright trusted each other more than they trusted anyone else in the world. They were going to need that. The sky over Normandy was not dark that night. It was on fire. Searchlights clawed up from the ground. Tracer rounds stitched red and green lines through the clouds. Engines roared as transport planes fought through flak that burst like burning flowers in the air. Inside C-7 number 437, Ken and Bob sat across from each other, surrounded by men of the 101st Airborne Division. Helmets on, faces blackened with charcoal, hands gripping rifles so tightly their knuckles went white. Ken and Bob didn't carry rifles. Their packs were stuffed with bandages, morphine syrettes, scissors, sulfa powder, and canvas medical pouches that weighed almost as much as ammunition. Weeks earlier, an instructor had told them plainly what their job would be. "You will go where the shooting is. You will run toward the wounded, not away. You will do it with no weapon. The only thing between you and a bullet is that red cross on your arm." And then he added the line that neither of them would ever forget. "If you don't do your job, boys who could have gone home won't." The red light over the jump door glowed. The inside of the plane stank of sweat, canvas, and fear. Somewhere behind them, a man was quietly praying. Somewhere in front, another was quietly trying not to throw up. Bob looked at Ken. Ken looked at Bob. No words, just a nod. "We do this together, or we don't do it at all." The light turned green. The jump master's hands slashed forward. One by one, paratroopers leapt into roaring darkness. Ken went first. Bob followed 3 seconds later. They dropped into a sky that wanted them dead. They did not land where the plan said they would. Almost no one did. The airborne drop over Normandy scattered men like leaves in a hurricane. Strong winds, low visibility, intense anti-aircraft fire pushing planes off course. Ken hit the ground hard, rolled, came up gasping in a hedgerow, his chute tangled in branches above him. For a brief moment there was silence. Then the world came crashing back. Shouts in English and German, distant explosions, the crack of rifles, someone screaming for his mother in the dark. Ken checked himself. Nothing broken. His aid kit was still strapped to him. He cut the chute free and moved. 20 yards away, he found Bob, limping slightly but upright. They didn't waste breath on conversation. They just looked at each other, nodded once, and started moving toward the sound that had already begun to haunt both their dreams. A man crying out for help. The first casualty lay half in a ditch, half on the dirt road. American paratrooper, maybe 19, face streaked with mud and tears, clutching his thigh where shrapnel had ripped through muscle. Blood pulsed through his fingers with every heartbeat. His eyes were wide and wet. He wasn't calling for a medic. He was calling for his mother. Ken dropped to his knees in the mud. Bob knelt beside him, keeping low as rounds snapped overhead. Tourniquet high on the leg, tighten until the flow stops. Pack the wound with the gauze. Talk to him, keep him present, keep him from slipping into shock. "What's your name?" Ken asked, hands moving fast. Jimmy Kowalski." "Where you from, Jimmy?" Chicago. Good town. You got a girl back there?" Jimmy nodded, teeth chattering despite the warmth of his own blood. "Then you're going home to her," Ken said, voice steady even as his hand shook. "You hear me? Not tonight. Not on my watch." They managed to drag him behind a low stone wall. But it was obvious that if they kept working like this, out in the open one casualty at a time, they were going to lose men simply because there was nowhere safe to put them. They needed walls, a roof, shelter. A French farmer appeared out of the darkness, white-faced and shaking. He pointed with a trembling hand down the road. "Là-bas, l'église." The church, Angoville-au-Plain. A name no one back home could pronounce. A place that, for the next 3 days, would mean more than its size on a map. The church was small, even by village standards. Thick Romanesque stone walls, a simple bell tower, weathered wooden doors that had opened for baptisms, weddings, funerals, and Sunday Mass for 800 years. It had never seen this. Ken and Bob shouldered the doors open. Dust hung in the air. Early light slipped through stained glass windows, painting the floor in muted reds and blues. For a heartbeat, it was quiet enough to hear their own breathing, and then the war burst back in. They dragged Jimmy Kowalski inside first, laid him on a pew. His boots left a red smear on the stone floor. Another casualty followed, then another. Within an hour, the pews, meant for families in their Sunday best, were lined with torn uniforms and bare, bloody skin. The altar became a treatment table. The baptismal font turned into a basin for washing hands and instruments. The aisle between the pews became a narrow river of mud, footprints, and bandage wrappers. Somewhere between the second and third stretcher, Ken and Bob made a decision that would define everything that followed. Ken caught a paratrooper at the door, rifle in his hands, eyes wild. "Leave it," Ken said, nodding at the weapon. "What?" "Leave it here. No guns inside." The man hesitated. Confusion furrowed his brow. "Why?" Bob answered without looking up from the patient he was treating. "Because this isn't the battlefield. Not anymore." Slowly, the soldier leaned his rifle against the wall outside. Weapons began to pile up just beyond the threshold. Rifles, carbines, a grenadier's tube, a German MP-40 someone had taken as a souvenir. The church was becoming something different, a sanctuary. And everyone who crossed into it could feel the change, even if they didn't yet understand. By the afternoon of the first day, 12 Americans lay on the pews. Then the door opened again. 2 gray-uniformed soldiers stumbled in, carrying a third man on a makeshift stretcher. A door ripped off its hinges. Germans. Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers, just like the Americans. Different flag, same blood stains. The man on the stretcher had a stomach wound. His field dressing had turned from white to brown to black. His lips were cracked. He was barely conscious. For a second, no one moved. The Americans near the back tensed, eyes narrowed. One hand twitched toward a weapon that wasn't there. The two German soldiers stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the Red Cross flags, the American uniforms, the bandages in enemy hands. Ken didn't ask for permission. He just stepped forward. "Put him down, right here," he said, tapping a clear space on a pew. The Germans didn't understand the words, but they understood the gesture. One of the wounded Americans, a sergeant named Dale Hoskins from Texas, tried to push himself up from his pew. "Hey, you're not seriously gonna—" Bob's voice cut through the room. "He's bleeding out, same as you were 2 hours ago. He goes on the bench. We patch him up. End of discussion." Hoskins sank back, teeth gritted, eyes still hard. But later, when no one was watching, he couldn't help glancing over at the German on the opposite pew. The man's name was Obergefreiter Klaus Bergmann, 22 years old, from Munich, a school teacher before the war. Bob was stitching the wound when Klaus's hand moved slowly toward his boot, a knife, small but sharp enough. Their eyes met. Bob didn't stop stitching, didn't flinch, didn't call for help. He just looked at Klaus and said quietly, "You could, but then who patches you up when I'm gone?" For 5 long seconds, the church held its breath. Then Klaus's hand moved away from the boot. He closed his eyes. A tear ran down his temple into the bandage wrapped around his head. "Danke," he whispered. It was the first German word Bob learned in that church. It would not be the last. Private Tommy Ritchie from Brooklyn landed in a tree. By the time his squad cut him down, his leg was shattered in 3 places and a German patrol was closing in. They dragged him to the church just as Ken was clearing space on the altar. Tommy kept apologizing, not for getting hurt, for crying. "My girl," he whispered through clenched teeth as Bob set the bone. "She's going to be so mad. I promised I'd come home for the wedding." His voice cracked. He was 19 years old. He'd proposed to Angela Moretti on the docks 3 weeks before shipping out. "I swore to her," Tommy said again, breath hitching. Ken didn't lie to him. The leg was bad. Infection was a coin flip. But he said the only true thing he could. "Then we better make sure you keep that promise. Setting that leg took 2 hours. No anesthesia, except morphine, which wasn't enough." Tommy screamed until his voice broke, until there was nothing left but gasping sobs. But the bone was set. The splint was firm. The bleeding stopped. Tommy made it. 3 months later, he was walking, limping, but walking. 6 months after that, there was a wedding in Brooklyn. Ken wasn't there. The war was still on. But decades later, Tommy's daughter would write Ken a letter. "My father says you're the reason I exist. I just wanted you to know that every good thing in my life started the day you refused to let him die." Marie Leclerc was 17, daughter of the village baker. She'd been up since 4 that morning, helping her father knead dough. Her hands still had flour on them when the shelling started. She'd been running for the cellar when an American shell, friendly fire, the cruelest kind, sent shrapnel screaming through the air. It caught her in the side, deep, abdominal, the kind of wound that killed slowly unless you moved impossibly fast. Her mother carried her into the church, screaming in French. Words Ken and Bob didn't understand, but the language of a mother's terror needs no translation. Marie's eyes were glassy, her breathing shallow, her lips already turning blue at the edges. Ken had done an abdominal procedure exactly twice in training on a dummy, with an instructor watching. Now it was a girl who still had flour on her hands from that morning's bread. "Talk to her," Ken told the mother, hands already moving. "Keep her awake. Don't let her sleep." The surgery took 40 minutes. No anesthetic left except a half dose of morphine, not enough. Marie screamed until her voice broke, then she just cried. Silent, shaking, eyes squeezed shut. Her mother held her hand and sang, an old French lullaby, the same one she'd sung when Marie was a baby. Ken's hands shook so badly that Bob had to hold the wound open while Ken stitched. Outside, artillery crashed. Inside, a mother sang. When it was over, Marie was still alive, barely, but live. 20 years later, Marie Leclerc would bring her own children to that church and show them a scar on her belly. This is where an American saved a French life while Germans and Americans were killing each other outside. Remember that. War makes us forget we're human. These men refused to forget. On the second night, Sergeant Dale Hoskins from Texas had had enough. He'd watched Germans being carried in. He'd watched Ken stitch them up. He'd kept quiet when his own morphine was rationed, so there'd be enough for everyone. But when another German NCO was laid on the pew directly across from him, something snapped. This wasn't just any German. This was Feldwebel Ernst Schaefer, an NCO whose men had ambushed Hoskins' squad that morning. Hoskins had watched his best friend, Jimmy Nguyen, a kid from California who could make anyone laugh, take a bullet through the throat. Jimmy had died choking on his own blood while Hoskins held him, helpless. And now, the man responsible was lying 3 feet away, getting the same treatment Hoskins had received. "No," Hoskins said, trying to push himself up despite the bandages across his chest. "Not him, not that one." The church went quiet. Bob looked up from changing a dressing. "Sergeant, I said no!" Hoskins' voice cracked. His face was red. Tears he refused to acknowledge ran down his cheeks. "You didn't see what they did. You didn't see Jimmy's face. You want me to lie here and watch you save the man who killed him?" Ken walked over slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't lecture. He just sat down on the edge of Hoskins' pew, close enough that no one else could hear. What Ken said, no one knows for certain. But witnesses remember that Ken spoke for about 5 minutes, quietly, his hand on Hoskins' shoulder. And Hoskins, who'd been shaking with rage, slowly went still. When Ken stood up, Hoskins lay back down. He didn't smile. He didn't apologize. But an hour later, when Feldwebel Schaefer started shivering from shock, it was Hoskins who pushed his own blanket across the aisle with his boot. Neither man spoke. Neither man looked at the other. But in the morning, the blanket was still there, and Ernst Schaefer was still alive. Late on the second day, the door opened with force, not the hesitant creak of the wounded, the decisive shove of authority. A German lieutenant stepped inside, flanked by 2 armed soldiers. His uniform was cleaner than most, his bearing sharp. This was someone used to being obeyed without question. He surveyed the room with cold efficiency. Americans, Germans, French, all mixed together. He spoke in clipped, precise English. This building is tactically valuable. We are commandeering it as a strong point." Bob stood up from the pew where he'd been wrapping a Frenchman's burned hand. "No," he said simply. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. "That was not a request, American." "And this isn't a negotiation," Ken added, stepping beside Bob. "This is a field hospital, protected under Geneva. You can't touch it." The lieutenant's mouth twitched. Almost a smile, almost contempt. "Geneva is a city very far from here, in a country that is not bleeding. This is Normandy. Do you see any diplomats?" One of his soldiers shifted. The barrel of his rifle rose slightly. The wounded men in the pews went silent, Americans and Germans alike. Bob didn't move. His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it. Certainty. "Shoot us if you want, but the second you do, this stops being a hospital and starts being a tomb. Every man in here dies. Ours, yours, all of them." The lieutenant glanced at the pews, at the bandages with German blood on them, at the morphine syrettes near wounded men in field gray uniforms. "You're fools," he said finally. "Maybe," Ken answered, "but we're fools who've kept 20 of your men alive in the last 36 hours. You want to be the one who explains to your command why you shot the only medics for 5 kilometers?" For a long moment, no one breathed. Then the lieutenant stepped back. "You have 24 hours, he said coldly. "After that, I cannot promise the war will respect your Red Cross." He turned. His men followed. The door closed. Ken and Bob stood there for a moment, hands still shaking from adrenaline they hadn't let show. "Think he meant it?" Bob asked quietly. "Does it matter?" Ken replied. They went back to work. They had 72 hours, not 24. But they didn't know that yet. On the third day, exhaustion was no longer a feeling. It was a physical weight. Ken and Bob had not slept more than 20 minutes at a time since the drop. Their hands were raw, their backs ached. Their eyes had that faraway focus that comes from seeing too much suffering in too short a time. But they kept moving, because if they stopped, people died. The sound of boots on the stone steps was different this time. Not the shuffle of the wounded, not the purposeful march of an officer, just footsteps, slow, heavy. The door opened. Framed in the light stood a German paratrooper, young, maybe 20, field gray uniform dusty and torn, helmet shadowing his eyes, rifle in his hands, barrel already pointing into the dim interior. He saw Americans first. His finger tightened on the trigger, then his gaze shifted. He saw a German NCO on a pew, Feldwebel Schaefer, abdomen wrapped in white, breathing shallow but steady. Next to him, an American with his arm in a sling. Same bandages, same care. On the other side of the aisle, a French boy slept, chest rising and falling. Marie Leclerc lay a few pews down, her mother still beside her. And in the narrow aisle between the pews, 2 men in blood-stained American uniforms moved from body to body without looking at the flags on the sleeves. Ken glanced up. He met the German soldier's eyes. There was no weapon in Ken's hands, no shield, nothing but a face streaked with sweat and grime and exhaustion. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't beg. He just looked at the man with the rifle. And in that moment, the whole insane simplicity of the place was written in his expression. "This is not your battlefield, not if we can help it." The church went silent. Even the wounded who could barely move held their breath. The German soldier could have opened fire. No one would have stopped him. Instead, something else happened. Slowly, the barrel of the rifle dipped. The soldier's shoulders loosened. He looked up at the cross over the altar, at the worn stone, at the stained glass catching the light. He looked down at his own boots, leaving wet prints on the ancient floor. Then he lifted his hand, not toward the trigger, but toward his own chest. He made the sign of the cross, a gesture that transcended uniforms, a gesture that said, "I see what this place is, I see what you are doing, and I will not be the one to break it." He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Then he stepped backward out of the doorway and pulled the door closed behind him. For a long moment no one moved. Then Bob let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "Jesus," he whispered. "Yeah," Ken said quietly, "something like that." For roughly 72 hours, that little church in Angoville-au-Plain functioned as the quietest, most stubborn protest against the logic of war. Estimates from unit histories and local records suggest that around 70 to 80 wounded men passed through those doors. Americans, Germans, French civilians, and incredibly, no one died inside, not because the wounds weren't severe enough. They were. Tommy Ricci's shattered leg, Marie's abdominal wound, Klaus Bergman's stomach injury, men with collapsed lungs, shrapnel in their spines, burns that covered half their bodies. Any of them could have died. All of them should have had a much lower chance of survival given the conditions. But they didn't die because two men simply refused to let go. They took what training they had and stretched it past the breaking point. They gave morphine when they had it. They held hands when they didn't. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. Eventually, the storm moved on. The front line pushed east. The sound of artillery faded into the distance. Reinforcements arrived. Actual medical units with actual supplies and actual doctors who looked at what Ken and Bob had accomplished and couldn't quite believe it. "You did this?" a captain asked, staring at the makeshift operating theater on the altar. "With this?" He held up Ken's battered aid kit. Ken just nodded, too tired to explain. When the last stretcher was carried out, Tommy Ricci, still apologizing, still asking if someone would write to Angela, Ken Moore and Robert Wright, finally stepped outside. The sun was setting. The village was quiet. Smoke drifted from distant fires. They were not the same men who had stepped into that church 3 days earlier. Their uniforms were ragged. Their hands were raw. Their backs ached. Their eyes had that 1,000-yard stare that would never fully leave them. Bob sat down heavily on the church steps. Ken sat beside him. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Bob said quietly, "We saved them." Ken nodded. "We did. All of them. All of them." Another silence. Then Bob started laughing, not from joy, from something else. Relief. Disbelief. Hysteria held at bay for 72 hours, finally breaking through. Ken started laughing too. Two exhausted men sitting on the steps of a blood-stained church, laughing like lunatics while the war moved on without them. They didn't get a parade right then. They got new orders, other battles, other fields, other wounded men waiting for the sound of boots and the words, "It's okay, I'm here, I've got you." But for 72 hours, they had done the impossible. When the war ended, Kenneth Moore and Robert Wright did what so many of their generation did. They went home. They married. They worked. They raised children in a country that had been spared the sight of tanks rolling down its streets. Ken became a teacher, high school biology. He never mentioned the war in class, but his students noticed things, the way he never raised his voice, even when students misbehaved, the way he always kept a fully stocked first aid kit in his desk, the way he would stop in the middle of a lesson if a student got hurt, moving with a speed and precision that seemed out of place for a man his age. Once a student asked him, "Mr. Moore, were you in the war?" Ken paused, chalk in hand, staring at the blackboard. "Yes," he said finally. "Did you kill anyone?" Ken turned around, looked at the kid, 16 years old, too young to understand what he was asking. "No," Ken said quietly. "I spent the war trying to do the opposite." He never elaborated. Bob Wright went back to Brooklyn. He didn't become a doctor. The GI Bill could have paid for it, but he couldn't do it. Too many ghosts. Instead, he became a paramedic. He worked the same streets where he'd grown up, driving an ambulance through neighborhoods where everyone knew his name. He never talked about Normandy, not to his wife, not to his kids. He couldn't explain that every patient he lost echoed back to a church where no one had died. For 40 years, Ken Moore and Robert Wright lived quiet lives, carrying loud memories they never shared. They exchanged Christmas cards, talked on the phone once or twice a year, never about the war, always about kids, grandkids, weather, baseball. Surface things, safe things, until 1984. In the early 1980s, a French historian researching D-Day came across a strange detail in the records of the 101st Airborne, a field aid station in Angoville-au-Plain, 70-plus casualties, treated. 0 deaths. It didn't make sense. Field aid stations weren't surgical hospitals. Men died in them all the time. But not here. The historian dug deeper, found the names, Kenneth Moore, Robert Wright, tracked them down, called them, told them that the village had never forgotten, that the church still stood, that the blood stains were still there, that people wanted to thank them. Ken almost said no, so did Bob, but their wives convinced them. "You should see it," Ken's wife said gently. "You should know that what you did mattered." In June 1984, 40 years after D-Day, Ken Moore and Robert Wright returned to Normandy. They were old men now, gray-haired, slower, wearing glasses and walking with the careful steps of men whose bodies remembered old injuries. The village met them at the church, hundreds of people, veterans, families, children, and grandchildren of the men they'd saved. Tommy Ricci was there, 60 years old now, still limping slightly, his wife Angela beside him, their 3 kids, 6 grandchildren. Marie Leclerc was there, middle-aged, a scar on her belly, and tears streaming down her face. Even a few Germans had come, old men with canes, men who'd once worn field gray and now wore suits, men who remembered being carried into a church by the enemy and walking out alive. Ken and Bob stepped inside. The church was exactly as they'd left it, same stone walls, same pews, same altar. Except now there were plaques, stained glass windows dedicated to paratroopers, flowers on the altar, and the stains still there, dark patches in the wood that had never washed out. Ken walked slowly down the aisle, touched the pew where Tommy had lain screaming, the pew where Klaus had cried, the pew where Marie had almost died. He knelt down, put his hand on the wood, and for the first time in 40 years, Kenneth Moore wept. Not from sadness, from relief. Because the thing he had done, the thing he'd been afraid no one would understand, the thing he'd carried alone for 4 decades, was still here, still real, still remembered. Bob stood beside him, tears running down his own face. "We didn't think anyone cared," Bob said to a French reporter later. The mayor of Angoville-au-Plain, a man whose grandfather had been in that church, wounded, saved, put his hand on Bob's shoulder. "Monsieur," he said, "nous avons pensé à vous chaque jour depuis que vous êtes parti. We have thought of you every day since you left." Kenneth Moore died in 1993. Robert Wright died in 2004. They were buried with military honors, flags on their coffins, salutes from young soldiers who hadn't been born when they jumped into Normandy. But their legacy didn't die with them. If you go to Angoville-au-Plain today, you can still walk into that church. You can still see the pews with the dark stains. You can still see the memorials that name them as men who chose mercy when hate would have been easier. 70 to 80 men walked out of that church alive. They went on to have lives, families, children, grandchildren, jobs, joys, sorrows, all the messy, beautiful complexity of being human. And every single one of those lives, every laugh, every kiss, every moment of wonder, traces back to two medics who refused to let the war win. For many people, World War II will always be defined by big images. The flag on Iwo Jima, the beaches of Normandy, the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima. But history is not built only out of big things. It's built out of small places where ordinary people made extraordinary choices. Two paratrooper medics in a cramped French church. An unnamed German soldier with a rifle and a conscience. A boy on a pew. Too young to understand why men in different uniforms bled the same. In a world that had every excuse to surrender to hate, they did something different. Kenneth Moore and Robert Wright wore American uniforms. They served under American flags. They were proud of that. But for 72 hours inside that church, they served something bigger than any one country. They served life. That choice didn't shorten the war. It didn't change the grand strategy. It didn't make the history books. But it changed the lives of every man who lay on those pews. It changed the way a village remembered Americans, not as conquerors, but as men who brought mercy. And it left behind a question that still waits for an answer. If one small church in one small village could refuse to hate when the whole world was burning, what excuse do we have? If two unarmed medics could look at a wounded enemy and see a patient, not a target, what does that say about what we might see when we look at people we've been told to fear? The men who fought that war are leaving us now, but some truths they lived are still here, in old stone walls, in dark stains on wood, in stories like this one. Two young Americans dropped into hell with nothing but bandages and determination. They walked into a church. They laid their hands on everyone who needed help. And for 3 extraordinary days, they proved that even in war, there is room for grace. That is their legacy. What we do with it is ours.